My name's Robert Ford. I'm a lecturer in politics in the University of Manchester, and I think that quantitative methods are an important part of the story in my discipline. We're increasingly seeing data being a big part of how we understand the world today, and I think it's important that our students learn to engage with that. I also think a lot of our students arrive a little bit afraid of data, a little bit alienated from data. Often they don't have a big background in maths or statistics, and by engaging with data in a non-threatening way, showing them how data can teach them about the world, hopefully they'll leave this university able to go out there and engage with data, which they'll be encountering in their everyday lives and also in the work that they do. One of the research projects I'm involved with is to run questions on the British Social Attitudes Survey, which is an annual omnibus survey fielded to about 3,000 to 4,000 people in the country. We ran a module of about 20 questions probing the British public's attitudes towards immigration. Well, we took a couple of questions, very general questions from the attitudes module, questions asking people whether they thought the economic impact of immigration on British society was positive or negative, and whether the cultural impact of immigration on British society was positive or negative. Those questions were originally asked on a 0 to 10 scale, but we rescaled it to make it easier for the students to see and understand the differences. And then we asked the students the same question in the same format and basically presented to them how their attitudes compared to the attitudes of the public generally. And what we found was that students at this university are very much more liberal about the effects of immigration than the average voter in Britain. So in the national survey, people tended to be very negative about the effects of immigration. Students tended to be very positive. And this provided a very interesting teaching experience because they were very surprised to discover just how far away they were from the average person out there in society at large. So introducing data in this way had a number of pedagogical advantages. A first one was that it introduced data to students in a naturalistic and non-threatening way. They carried out the survey themselves, they saw how the data was generated for themselves, and then they saw the same data for the general population. So instead of being a sort of alien lump of data dropped from above, as it were, it was a process that they found themselves participating in, and that made it much more naturalistic, less threatening. Secondly, the students, by using this data and by comparing their own attitudes to the general population, they could see how differences emerge within society, and that got them to think about how different groups may have different attitudes, what sort of social processes might produce those differences in views, and why they can't necessarily infer about the views of other groups in society from their own attitudes and their own experiences. And a third advantage was it enabled a conversation about how data gets generated and the limits to the processes by which it's produced. So they got to talk about how was this survey administered, how reliable did they think the questions were, what did they think about the way that the questions got asked, and because they'd done the questions themselves, they could actually input their own experience of answering the questions, what they were thinking about when they answered the questions, in thinking about those processes. So that enabled them to really engage with the idea of how do we generate data about the world and then use it to critically engage with thinking about how others think about these issues. Well, the final thing that we found that we could do with the survey is we could start to introduce to students the idea of how we can explore whether or not differences between groups are meaningful. It gets a little bit hazardous at this point because you don't want to introduce statistics too rapidly, because then the engagement you've achieved by getting them to think about the data and participate in the data, they can then disengage a bit if they see complex statistical formulas, discussions of significance using technical language. So the way to get around that, I think, is to provide them with a kind of conceptual discussion about, well, look at these differences in the raw numbers. Do we think those differences are meaningful? How would we establish whether those differences are meaningful or not? Could they have been produced by chance? And in that way get them to think about the concepts that lead into the sort of abstract technical world of statistical testing and significance, so that the groundwork is there and they're prepared to be using those concepts in a more advanced way in courses in the second and the third year. But one of the interesting things about this whole experience was when we first set these things up, there was a lot of concern, as there often is, that introducing this kind of statistical material would be quite dry, the students might find it quite boring. But in fact what we found was the opposite. The students found it very engaging. By participating in the data generation process, they got quite excited about it, and it got them talking in a very sort of engaged, energetic way about how these kinds of surveys, which they encounter all the time in their everyday life, get produced and what they might mean. So rather than being a dry and boring process for the students, it was actually an exciting and engaging one, which was a pleasant surprise.